It has been 2.5 years and people still get strength wrong within this game. And this is done in several ways, including the misinterpretation of the two-handed property, the underestimated plethora of strength-based light weapons, as well as the dismissal of status-effective builds just because of the lack of native bleed buildup. Before we go any further, let's have a discussion what strength is, and simply put, strength is the physical build. It gives you physical defense, and it gives you some of the best physical damage in the game. In fact, up until recently, it was unmatched for physical damage. Now, strength is seen as the unga bunga stat compared to dexterity. And that is true with the main advantage that strength has, which is a two-handed property. But this right here is where you get a lot of misinterpretations on how this even works. So, the general idea of the two-handed property is when you two-hand a weapon, you gain a 50% increase to effective strength. Effectively, if you have 60 strength, it would act like you have 90 strength for its calculations. With this, you'd assume that you'd be at your 80 strength soft capped with only 54 points of strength invested. This right here would allow for the heavy infusion to have the highest physical AR for any infusion, with almost no exception. This sounds incredible, in fact almost too good to be true. And that's because it is. In reality, it only affects two-handed weapon attacks, and when I say that, it's a standard attack. It has zero effect on critical strikes, paired weapon attacks, bow damage, and skill damage. Even it does appear to be using both hands. So it's not going to affect things like Sword Dance, Lion's Claw, or any other Ash War. Now, Roar Ash Wars are an exception, but that's because it's still part of the quote-unquote standard moveset. And this right here doesn't seem like much, but it actually matters a lot, as it's one of the major reasons why the Great Katana is still viable on a dex build. Additionally, this right here can affect strength setups. A lot of players assume as soon as they hit 54 that they are soft cap and they are no longer going to get too much returns on their investment, and that is just not true if you're using skills and you're using critical strikes. And if you're playing a strength build, you are definitely getting critical strikes. However, two-handing does visibly increase your AR, and it clearly does lower the requirements. You do have a 50% strength bonus there somehow. And in a way, yes, it does reduce the weapon requirement by about 33%, so this is the reason why dex builds usually need less investment for a great bow than even strength builds. Now here's the thing, for the two-handed property it works a little different. So while it does visibly increase your AR, it does increase your AR for the input of certain motion values of a standard moveset. In fact, it works in a very similar way to the two-handed sword talisman. Meanwhile, Ashes of War, specifically Bold Ashes of War, aren't even based on your AR at all. They are based off of just your strength value thrown into a bold projectile calculator multiplied by your buffs. Your effective strength and AR just do not matter here. However, there's something that does heavily benefit from the two-handed property, and that would be the claw mark seal. As counterintuitive as it may seem, the claw mark seal does definitely benefit from the two-handed property, so much so that it is very similar to an almost dedicated caster build on a Faith build or even on a Faith Arcane build. Now, is it going to be as high? No, you're going to see a little bit of damage discrepancy, but it's actually not by much at all. At least if you're within some sort of reasonable level bracket, where the most you could probably see is probably about a 10% damage discrepancy. Overall, does it make strength builds overpowered? No, but it does add a level of versatility to strength builds that are quite effective. However, not everything is two-handed with strength builds. The over-heavy focus on heavy weapons does diminish a huge part of strength, and that's the fact that strength is still great with paired as well as one-handed weapons. I mean, light weapons are great for strength builds. And yes, I know that fists are pretty obvious, as well as a lot of other weapons associated with dex builds like the Bandit's Curved Sword or the Bloodhound Claws. I mean, in general, it has a huge plethora of weapons that do great with. The Bandit's Curved Sword, for example, as I just mentioned, has only a 4 damage difference from a Keen build. Meanwhile, when you look at straight swords, you have the Sword of Light and the Sword of Darkness, which has the highest AR out of any other straight sword in the game. In addition, strength builds have access to the broadsword, which has one of the highest ARs out of any of the infusible straight swords. And finally, we have one of the best curved swords in the game, in which I need to talk about because this right here has amazing blood loss buildup despite being very short, and that's the Beastmen's curved swords. Now this right here actually has a higher AR for any other blood-based curved sword in the game, when of course it's blood infused, outdealing the damage of something like the bandits or the scavengers, while also scaling really good into New Game Plus. And so pretty much the message I'm getting across is that strength does have very fast weapons that do an incredible amount of damage. And if you want a really great one which has native bleed on it, you have the Grave Scythe. Now it's not normally a fast weapon, but it can be very fast with spinning weapon and Blood Flame Blade, making it generally one of the fastest and best bleed tools in the game. And the damage it does, especially as a consecutive attack weapon, is fantastic. But of course, yes, I'm now in the category of status effect, because that is one thing that is oftentimes underrated on strength builds. And this is mostly due to the fact that oftentimes they're associated with dexterity or arcane because they get more native options to it. But that doesn't mean that they're not great on strength builds. They can be incredibly great. And I already mentioned, you could get the claws, or you could go for the curved swords, or you could go for the Grave Scythe. But you also have two weapons with two very special properties that no other builds get outside of arcane, and it gives strength one hell of an advantage, and that is special treatment. The Sword Lance and the Warped Axe specifically have an exceptionally high status effect buildup when it's given the correct infusion. And when I say exceptionally high, I mean higher than anything in its class. In fact, it is a whole nother weapon class higher. And that is insane because these weapons are actually incredibly fast. And the Warped Axe has the AR of a Great Axe, the blood loss of a Great Axe, the speed of a light weapon, and incredibly high scaling. Additionally, whenever you use an Ash War like Spinning Slash or Sword Dance, it uses the faster animation that you do not get within any heavy weapon. And one that's even more ridiculous is the Sword Lance, because the Sword Lance has a blood loss buildup of a colossal weapon. And while yes, it does take a hefty hit to its AR, that does mean it has a higher blood loss buildup than any weapon in the game outside of the Blood Fiend weapons. And for the most part, that is huge, because the Sword Lance has a higher physical AR than any of the heavy thrusting swords or great spears in the game, with a moveset between both of them. And while doing piercing damage, has a blood loss buildup of a colossal weapon. And thrusting swords, despite being like large weapons, aren't really that slow, and they have a lot of options in order to capitalize on that higher damage anyways, with moves like repeating thrust. And while I stuck on blood loss for a while, it includes all status infusions in the game. This could be blood loss, yes, but this could also be poison, and this could be frostbite. So in truth, in order to play a good status effect build, you do not need to be building like Dex or Arcane to do so. Yes, dexterity weapons do have true combos, and yes, Arcane scales 2/3 of all the status effects build-ups. But honestly, do not sleep on strength for this category, because it could be absolutely gnarly. So I've been yapping for the last 8 minutes now, so where am I getting at? Well, strength builds are much more diverse than what they're made out to be. Oftentimes, yes, they do get that two-handing bonus, but it's not the only thing that strength builds are. They're able to use like status effect builds almost as good as an arcane or dexterity build. And additionally, strength builds do not need a two-hand. In fact, two-handing is just what gives it an edge over dexterity builds. But if you want to power stance curved swords or straight swords or something, yeah, go right ahead for it. It could do incredible damage. So you don't really have to commit to just doing fist or unga bunga, because strength is more than that. Alright guys, thank you for getting this far in the video. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have an awesome day.